Why, though we hunted high and low, and hunted everywhere, the three men's fate, we found no trace. In any time, in any place, but a door ajar and an untouched needle, and an over-toppled chair.
Hello and welcome back to my world of stuff. My name is Paul Mount. Yesterday I'm looking at one of my favourite classic series, Doctor Who serials from 1977. It's The Horror of Fang. This is a story which to me is a textbook example of how to tell a tight, concise, low budget Doctor Who story. And it's one which I would suggest that all future showrunners of the series look at. And it will remind them that it doesn't all have to be flashy CGI and expensive, extravagant special effects. You can tell a really good, claustrophobic, terrifying Doctor Who story with a handful of sets and a handful of actors. I'll come back to that in a moment. First of all, though, a little bit of housekeeping around the channel. If you are new here, it will be wonderful if you would press the like and subscribe button to stick around to see more of the goodies on this channel. Loads of stuff here, cult TV, cult films, unboxings, plenty of Doctor Who here and there. All sorts of goodies. So please think about liking and subscribing. Just think about it and then perhaps do it. You can do it by clicking that button thing there or holding your camera up to that QR code, which will automatically subscribe you to the channel. Because I'm sure you don't want to miss out. You don't want to miss out. And on that basis of subscribing, I would like to say a huge welcome to the dozens, and I do mean dozens of new subscribers who come on board in the last couple of days as a result of my video about the Doctor Who missing episodes. I'm not going to call it rumour because I think it's more than that. You're all very welcome. It's great to see so many people watching that video. It's counting up to 4,000 views, which if you're a regular on this channel, you know, doesn't happen all that often. So it was very nice when it does. And as a result, new subscribers came on board. It wasn't a clickbait video. I didn't do it to get new subscribers. I sort of knew it would do well because Doctor Who stuff tends to do quite well on the channel. But I did have something to say about that story. I'm going to avoid calling it a rumour. I just wanted to sit down and just chat about how this has come about and what's possible and what's not possible and where we may be going with these missing episodes. So welcome aboard as I say, dozens of new subscribers. It's flattering to see the subscriber numbers flying up with the distinct possibility now that I might reach my dream total of 3,000 subscribers by Christmas. We still got a bit of a way to go, so that's why I'm flying the flag and saying if you're interested, please stick around. It'd be great to have you on board. A couple of other things, in fact, from that video, I just wanted to tidy up as well. I had totally forgotten, and I'm very grateful to those viewers who reminded me that when Enemy of the World and Web of Fear were returned to the BBC archive in 2013, they were released digitally first on iTunes, and people could go on and pay a couple of quid per episode. I know I did that. I know I bought them and I watched them digitally. I had totally forgotten that in the intervening years because I think I've moved away from downloading and digital purchases and stuff. So it just totally disappeared from my head. And if I remember correctly, and again I may be wrong, I think they came out on DVD the following March. Certainly a few months later they arrived on DVD, and then a couple of years later on DVD releases with special features and documentaries and so on. So thank you very much to the people who reminded me about that digital release. I'd totally forgotten it. And also, to tidy up a possible misconception, I think I mentioned that the classic 60s BBC comedy The Likely Lads had been returned in full. I didn't mean it to come across as all the episodes had been recovered. I think in my head I conflated the audios of missing episodes with videos of missing episodes, and a box set was released of every episode, but some of them are on audio. I don't believe that every episode has been found visually yet, although that may happen. So I think there was a misapprehension on my part that I gave the wrong impression or got a bit confused. In my noggin, it happens when you get to my age. And just a quick mention of an event coming up in December that you might want to put in your diary if you're in North Wales, lovely part of the world. If you're a fan of Doctor Who, Harry Potter, Game of Thrones, any of the big fantasy genres, Batman even, and then there is a personal appearance being made by Spencer Wilding. Now, you may not know the name. You probably will, actually. You probably will have seen it in the credits of any number of great big fantasy epics over the last few years. He is a Welsh actor, stunt performer and a kickboxer born in Denbigh in North Wales. He's had some success as a professional kickboxer and a professional cruiserweight boxer. He was actually trained by former 3-time champion Russ Williams. He's since gone on to have a prolific career in the film and TV industry. As I've mentioned, he's been in Game of Thrones, where he played a White Walker. I'm not entirely sure what that is. I don't watch Game of Thrones. He was a bartender in Batman Begins. He was a giant Egyptian in The Gold Compass, the failed film version of the first in Philip Pullman's fantasy trilogy, His Dark Materials. He was Benicio del Toro's Wolfman body double in the Wolfman film. He has made appearances in 3 Doctor Who episodes, perhaps most famously as the Ice Warrior in the Matt Smith episode Cold War, which reintroduced the Doctor's Martian enemies for the first time on TV since 1974. And also, he was in Rogue War, a Star Wars story where he shared duties playing Darth Vader. So he's had a huge and expansive career on television. He's also had roles where he's appeared himself without prosthetics and masks and so on. But anyway, if you fancy having a chat to Spencer, meeting up with him, getting a photograph taken and getting his autograph, he is making a personal appearance at the Ink in Colwyn Bay on the 6th of December from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. So if you're interested in meeting somebody who's possibly an unsung hero in the world of fantasy and television, but the sort of actor without whom lots of these shows would not be what they are, highly recommended then if you do fancy having a chat to a big figure in the world of fantasy and TV. Pop along on the 6th of December to the Ink and Colwyn Bay and meet Spencer Welding. And finally, before we start talking about Doctor Who properly, you may have noticed a little bit of spring cleaning around the channel, a slightly edited title sequence and new title music and end title music. This is something that I do every year or so, just to give the channel a bit of a fresh lick of paint, just to spruce it up a little bit. So let me know what you think of the new titles, and particularly the music, because the titles haven't changed much. I think it's just slightly shorter. And let me know what you think of the new music. If you don't like it, if you prefer the old music, and I bet you don't really give a damn, then let me know in the comments down below and I'll see about reinstating the previous ones. Right, after all that preamble, let's take a trip to Fang Rock. The Horror of Fang Rock was the first serial in the 15th season of classic Doctor Who, and it aired from the 3rd of September to the 24th of September on successive Saturday evenings. And it is, as I think I hinted at very broadly, absolutely one of my favourite Doctor Who serials. I rewatched it last week and I just think it is magnificent in so many ways. It's an interesting story where it falls into the chronology of Doctor Who and where Doctor Who was at the time. This was a period where Doctor Who was starting to change a little bit. Tom Baker had been a huge success in the role. Ratings had soared. Under the producership of Philip Hinchcliffe, with Robert Holmes script writing, the show had matured and become more sophisticated, and it moved out of the nursery and it was appealing more to teenagers and adults, and particularly students who were really drawn in by Tom Baker's eccentric and bohemian depiction of the Doctor. But the stories had become more sophisticated and they were less reliant on rubber monsters thrashing about in unit soldiers. All great fun in the Pertwee era, but it was felt as the 70s moved on that the show needed to grow up a little bit, and it certainly did. Unfortunately, it did then attract the ire of Mary Whitehouse and the National Viewers and Listeners Association, who were regularly complaining about the show's violence and graphic horror, things which are quite tame by today's standards. But in the mid-70s, I suppose that it's true that the producer and his script editor were pushing the show a little bit to see how far they could go with it. Fortunately, the BBC, instead of standing up and telling Mrs. Whitehouse to go away, capitulated, and Philip Hinchcliffe, who had been planning a 4th and final season as a producer, was moved on to another project, and a new producer, Graham Williams, was brought in as his replacement. And he was under strict instructions to tame Doctor Who down a little bit, to take the violence and the graphic scares out of the show. As Doctor Who fans, we know where that led. We know that this particular season, season 15, saw the introduction of K9, which instantly, in my mind, lowered Doctor Who's average audience age from about 15 or 16 to about 9, because this was a robot dog that was clearly introduced to appeal to children and to take the sting away from the horror and the nastiness that had been inherent in the show for a few years. That was all to come later in the season and in subsequent years. But the Horror of Fang Rock is a very interesting story because it falls quite squarely in that Philip Hinchcliffe feel, in that it's gothic and atmospheric and dark and creepy and a little bit disturbing. Even now, watching it nearly 50 years later, still has the power to unnerve. The genesis of the story is also quite interesting. It's written by Terrance Dicks. Many of us call him Uncle Terry, Uncle Terrance, because of all the work he did churning out all those Doctor Who Target books back in the 1970s, which were, for many of us, the introduction to classic Doctor Who that we hadn't seen or had forgotten, the shows from the 60s that he novelised, and more recent stories. This was before the time of videotapes and DVDs and Blu-rays and so on. You watched Doctor Who on television on a Saturday, you didn't see it at all. That's all changed, of course, but he created this library of Doctor Who stories in the form of these novelizations, which was so enormously popular. And he was the script editor of Doctor Who. He started working on the show in the late 60s. He became script editor for about 5 years in the 70s. He really shaped and formed and created Doctor Who as we know it in the 1970s, along with his own producer, Barry Letts. But he didn't actually write many stories himself. He co-wrote The War Games with Malcolm Hulke. He wrote Tom Baker's debut story, Robot. He also wrote Brain of Morbius, which was to come in season 13. But that, of course, famously was rewritten so much by Robert Holmes that Terrance Dicks walked away and said, put some Bland pseudonym on it. So it was attributed to a Robin Bland. I'm sure that during his time as script editor, Terrance tinkered with a lot of scripts and brought them up to scratch. The Horror of Fang Rock is only his third script credit for the show, amazingly. The story came about because he was originally writing a story called The Vampire Mutations. You can imagine the connotations that brings with it, fangs and blood and monsters and so on. Unfortunately, at the time, the BBC were working on their own prestigious version of Bram Stoker's Dracula, starring Louis Jourdan. If you've never seen that, by the way, track it down. It's a superb adaptation of Dracula. Perhaps understandably, the BBC was slightly worried about their version of Dracula being undermined by a Doctor Who vampire story, which they assumed, because with Doctor Who, might be a little camp and silly. I don't know why they were thinking that, because Doctor Who would become that, but not at this point. But they understandably perhaps didn't want two vampire productions vying for attention in the same TV season. So the Doctor Who production office was asked to sort of shelve that one and come up with something else. Vampire Mutations, incidentally, did finally appear on screen in 1980 under the title of State of Decay, when Terrance Dicks rewrote it for season 18, Tom Baker's final season. Horror of Fang Rock then came about as a replacement, and again is quite amusing in that the idea of setting a story in a lighthouse came about. Robert Holmes, who was still script editor at this point, asked Terrance Dicks if he'd write it, and I think he more or less dragged him into writing the story about a lighthouse, much as a few years before, Terrance Dicks, the script editor, had dragged Robert Holmes kicking and screaming back into the Middle Ages to write The Time Warrior. It wasn't a story that Robert Holmes was particularly interested in writing. It wasn't an era he was particularly interested in writing about, but inevitably he delivered the goods, and The Time Warrior is a cracking John Pertwee story. Terrance Dicks wasn't quite so happy about the idea of writing a story set in a lighthouse for obvious reasons, but I'm going to say it here and now, I think he delivered 4 brilliant scripts. And these are scripts which demonstrate to me the power and versatility of Doctor Who as a format. We think of Doctor Who these days, of course, I suppose we think of the more recent incarnation of the series, which is all CGI and spectacle and bang and flash and loud music and overwrite performances. But I don't think Doctor Who needs any of that. And this is why I said earlier on that I think anybody who's going to work on Doctor Who in the future as the showrunner or producer or whatever title that they choose to call themselves, they need to look at stories like this. 4 episodes with a small cast, a limited location, very little in the way of special effects, but a story dripping in atmosphere, dripping in rich, evocative dialogue and believable, well-fleshed out characters with a genuinely creepy alien threat. It falls within what became known in the 60s as base under siege type stories. These were stories where, for budgetary reasons, most of the events would take place in one location, whether it was a base on the moon or a base on Earth or a space station. One huge central set with a couple of smaller sets. The budget would focus on a big set. And inevitably, the story would focus on the Doctor and his companions arriving somewhere at a time of crisis. There's an outside hostile force which is laying the base under siege in an attempt to invade it and take it over. Bases under siege. We've had loads of those over the years. I think we've even had some in the modern series. But I think that the Horror of Fang Rock is a real return to that format in the most claustrophobic and unnerving and terrifying form of all, because we have a story set in a lighthouse with everything that entails: spiral staircases, crew rooms, a lamp room looking down over the sea. There's nowhere to run, there's nowhere to hide, and those are the things that Terrance Dicks really preys on in his scripts. The story itself reflects Wilfred Gibson's The Ballad of Flannan Isle, which Tom Baker quotes extremely atmospherically at the end of the story, which is a true story about a lighthouse that was found unmanned. The crew had disappeared, nobody found out what happened to them, and it was a real folklore, Victorian sort of mystery. And that forms the basis for this gripping and fascinating and utterly compelling 4-part serial. The story is actually set in the early 20th century. The Doctor and Leela have effectively moved forward just a few years in time from the end of the previous season, with its finale story, Robert Holmes' The Talons of Weng Chiang. The story sets out its stall and the first of its bunch of characters in its very first scenes, really well written character scenes that, at a stroke, tell you what you need to know about these characters, these 3 keepers on this lighthouse. 3 different generations of men. We've got Reuben, the crusty, old-fashioned, set-in-his-ways senior lighthouse keeper, played by actor Colin Douglas. He's grumpy, he's irritable, he's annoyed that the lighthouse is being converted to electricity because he's an oil man through and through. Then we have Ben, played by Ralph Watson. He's middle-aged lighthouse keeper. He embraces new technology and he's trying to sell to Reuben, who's ever the skeptic, the benefits for electricity and the future that electricity may have if people just learn to accept it. And we also have Vince, played by John Abbott. He's a young lighthouse keeper. He's fresh-faced and naive. He looks up to Ben and he respects Reuben. He knows his place in the pecking order. He's learning the job of being a lighthouse keeper. And he's very naive and he's very innocent, very wide-eyed. These 3 characters are really well established in these opening sequences where Vince watches something plunge out of the sky. A meteor or something, a shooting star, drops into the sea nearby. Ben and Reuben are a bit dismissive of it, and then we see scenes of them just talking, and you establish that sort of slightly stifling relationship that you must have in this sort of environment when you're cooped up for weeks on end with no privacy and only each other for company. Meanwhile, in a slightly unconvincing model shot, the TARDIS materialises in the shadow of the lighthouse, and they've overshot the opening of the Brighton Pavilion where they were trying to go. The Doctor's curiosity is immediately piqued when he notices that the light on the lighthouse is out. We've seen earlier that the light keeps flickering on and off. Something's affecting the power supply. They go to investigate the lighthouse, little realising that something nasty has already happened to Ben. The Doctor, of course, is more than a little bit suspicious. He thinks that there's something strange going on the island of Fang Rock where the lighthouse is based. And of course, he's not far short of the mark. There is something nasty out there. A creature has plunged from the sky and is investigating the lighthouse and its power source. And we see these sort of fisheye views of something watching the island and watching the lighthouse with these strange green tints and this strange aquatic gurgling sound, which tells the audience that there's something alien out there. The first episode then establishes really well the bantering relationship between the Doctor and Leela and how they interact with the lighthouse crew. The lighthouse crew, understandably, just think that the Doctor and Leela have crashed on the island during the strange fog that's come up since Vince saw the light in the sky. But the Doctor realises there's something else going on. The first episode really sets the tone with the great character work that we've got here. The Doctor and Leela really work well together, despite the fact that there was still some tension between Tom Baker and Louise Jameson. I think on the DVD commentary for the story, Louise Jameson recalls how they were filming a sequence in the crew room set and Tom Baker constantly came in earlier than his cue, so he would effectively upstage Louise Jameson, who was doing her bit at the time. Louise Jameson, understandably, was a little bit peeved by this. She insisted that they keep doing it until Tom Baker did it the way it was rehearsed. And apparently their relationship, which was strained and difficult, became a little bit easier because I think he realised that she wasn't one to be messed with and that she would stand her ground. I think with Tom Baker, I think it's famously said that he would challenge people a little bit because he was the man in charge. He was the one who was making Doctor Who a huge hit in the late 70s. And he didn't suffer fools gladly, but he would very often see how far he could push things with fellow actors and co-stars. And once he respected them, and once he knew that they respected him, then the relationships would often flatten out and they would get on a lot better. Tom Baker had this a lot with his companion actors and actresses. Louise Jameson clashed with him. Mary Tam would later clash with him. But in later life, he mellowed and they had much better working relationships. So this first episode has this lovely stuff, particularly from Tom, because here he is still very much in the mould of his first 3 seasons. He hasn't yet descended into the comedy and knockabout stuff and slapstick and Google eyes at the camera and these little cliched lazy comedy things that he would do later on in this season and for the rest of his run, really, and until he was reined in his final season. Here he is still the mysterious, enigmatic alien, and looking at it, it's quite odd to think that his performance, which is quite cold and detached, was so popular with the audience, because with Tom Baker you certainly felt in his first 3 years that he's not one of us. He's an alien who is a bit disdainful of humanity. He likes us and admires us, but he has no patience with us and our petty wars and arguments and territorial disputes. He's always there but not there. And Tom Baker himself has often said this. With the Doctor, his Doctor, you felt that he was looking into eternity and infinity and thinking about things, and he knew secrets that he wouldn't disclose, and he was very much an outsider in any situation, and that was something that he played so well in his first 3 seasons. He was a character who you would think would be hard to warm to, but the audiences did warm to him, and watching him in this particular story, you can really sense that he is playing an alien. He is not playing a comedy character as he did later on. He's not playing a more humanized version of the Doctor that we get in the modern series. It is, I'm going to say, Tom Baker's last really fine performance. He's very good in Image of the Fendal a couple of stories later, but the performance gets a bit looser and a bit slacker and a bit less intense from this point onwards, because Graham Williams was now the producer. He was less inclined to rein Tom Baker in and make him play it straight, and given the edict from the BBC to make the show more family friendly, he wasn't particularly inclined to encourage Tom to make the Doctor darker. But I think here and later Image of the Fendal, there is a darkness at the heart of the Doctor, hearts of the Doctor, which you don't really see much more of anymore, which is a shame. But yet you still admire him because of the way he deals with people. He's very brusque with people. It is a great performance, and Tom's at his best here. The first episode ends with the fog that's encroaching around Fang Rock Lighthouse getting even thicker, and a sailing ship crashes against the rocks. Famously, of course, this is a very obvious model shot of a wooden Woolworths model ship crashing onto the rocks. Onto the lighthouse come a bunch of survivors from the crashed yacht, and they're a fantastic bunch of characters, so beautifully written and so beautifully and evocatively brought to life by Terence Dix's sharp, culturally aware dialogue. He really picks up on the mores and habits and the way people spoke in the early part of the 20th century. There's lots of little side references that really flesh out the characters and the fact that they're from the early 20th century. They are a motley crew, to say the least. We have Lord Palmerdale, played by Sean Caffrey. He is desperate to get back to London to close a business deal, and he won't accept that even though the ship has crashed, they can't get back to London, even though the Doctor tells him in no uncertain terms, you've no chance in this fog. He's frustrated. He's got some information or something that he wants to do back in London, and it transpires that that's information that he somehow procured from Skin Sail, played by Alan Rowe. Alan Rowe had appeared in Doctor Who and the Time Warrior. He would go on to appear in Full Circle in Tom Baker's final season. Skin Sail is a politician who's clearly falling on hard times. He's had gambling debts. He's come to a deal with Palmerdale to his benefit, but which will ruin him professionally if it becomes known. He's a member of Parliament. Also part of the group is Lord Palmerdale's secretary, Adelaide, played by Annette Woolard. She again is, I suppose, a stereotype of a brash, flashy party girl in the early 20th century. She is Palmerdale's secretary, but Skin Sail refers to her as Lord Palmerdale's fancy piece. So it's clear that there's something adult going on here, which is sort of unusual in a Doctor Who story to have those sorts of references. She is an interesting character in that she is the complete opposite of Leela, where Leela is this brave, feisty warrior woman she's not scared of anything. She'll go out into the dark to find this creature that's out there with a knife. She will challenge anything because that's her way as a warrior of the Sever team. Adelaide, however, is a screamer. She is terrified of everything. She shrieks and screams. She is aghast at their situation, at having had to abandon this luxury yacht to find themselves in the rather squalid environment of a lighthouse's crew quarters. And she screams on several occasions, quite shrilly as well, it has to be said. But it's a really good performance from Annette Woolard as this terrified young girl who's trying to look disdainfully at what's around her, but relying on what's around her to keep her alive. We also have Rio Fanning as Harker. He's the helmsman of the ship, and he curses Lord Palmerdale for forcing them to go faster so he can get back to London, which has caused them to crash on the rocks. So you've got this motley group of people, including the Doctor and Leela, trapped on a lighthouse. There's an alien creature who's trying to get in, and the inevitable happens. But again, what's interesting about the story really is that this alien creature that has arrived on Fang Rock, it's got no interest in the human beings there. It doesn't care about them. It's not there for them. They, when they all die, and they do all die, the only ones who get off Fang Rock alive are the Doctor and Leela. They're all collateral damage. The creature just wants to get to the lighthouse. It wants the power source it's identified so it can use it to send a signal out to its mothership so it can be rescued. And considering that we think of Terrence Dicks as Uncle Terrence, this is a really savage, brutal story because all the supporting characters are killed. Quite nastily, they're all electrocuted. It starts off with Ben, the lighthouse keeper, who's electrocuted in episode 1. Then later on, there are gruesome deaths. Lord Palmerdale suffers a gruesome death. I think Adelaide's death is the most shocking because part of the story is that this creature is a shape-shifting alien and it takes the form of Reuben, Colin Douglas's character. And he has this strange rictus grin and waxen complexion. And there's a sequence, quite a blunt sequence, where he's in the crew room, puts his hand on Adelaide's head, and this electric bolt goes through her and kills her outright. Similarly, in the last episode, Skin Sail, who is the last man standing, his greed gets the better of him when he stumbles down the stairs to pick up some discarded diamonds and is attacked and killed by the creature. The creature itself is a Rutan. This is a deadly mortal enemy of the Sontaran, old enemies of the Doctors. And again, this is a nice way to use Doctor Who continuity. This is a nice piece of backstory which adds colour and depth to the Doctor Who universe, because we know the Sontarans, and now we meet the Rutans, who are their deadly enemies, and they're referenced again throughout Doctor Who in certain places. But it just makes the Doctor Who universe seem more joined up. The Rutan is a green jelloid mass that trails out these white tentacles behind it. It looks truly alien. It looks really horrible, repulsive. It does what classic Doctor Who monsters, the Daleks, do. It loses the human form. This is not a man in a costume. This is a, whatever they used at the time, a balloon, and inflated it and covered it in bits of cotton wool and so on to make it look properly alien. And it works fantastically. It uses the voice of Colin Douglas, Reuben, because it's taken him over in the past, so it uses Reuben's voice. And to hear this gurgling dialogue in this conversation that it has with Tom Baker's Doctor on the stairs really seems like a proper hostile alien thing. When the story was released on Blu-ray a few years ago, as is often the case, some of the effects were tidied up. One of the effects that they tidied up was the Rutan, and they replaced it with some sort of puppet affair, which doesn't look anything like as good, because it's clearly a model. And as much as I admire and advocate physical effects, the original Rutan was a physical effect. It was a very, very basic prop that was filmed really well to make it look really alien. But in the Blu-ray version, it just looks like what it is, which is some sort of puppet affair. It doesn't have the same impact for me. So I love this story because it does everything I want Doctor Who to do. It's got good, well-developed supporting characters, something we don't get enough of in the modern series. It's got a great Doctor and a great companion. It's got some exciting ideas. It's got some really chilling moments. There are a couple of sequences where the Rutan, which is still outside the lighthouse, utters this horrible, blood-curdling, almost like a war cry. And when you hear that, I think it's the end of episode 2, and then perhaps in episode 3, it is quite blood-chilling because it's a horribly alien, distorted sound. And the characters sort of hear this thing. And there's the dialogue where the Doctor admits he's made a mistake, that he's locked the creature inside. And the Doctor's very often on the back foot, and in the last episode, he has to scramble to find a way to sort out this situation because the Rutans want to exploit Earth's strategic position in their battle with the Sontarans. It is really such a good story. I can't say enough about this story. I love everything about it. The production has got those BBC classic series values of the sets full of bits and pieces and ephemera and things that you probably don't even notice. The lighthouse itself is beautifully put together. The effects, there are a couple of dodgy effects. As I mentioned, the model shot of the TARDIS landing is obviously a model shot. When the Doctor and Leela arrive, they are on the rocks of Fang Rock, but they're clumping about on wooden sets. The model shot of the yacht crashing is a very obvious model shot. There's a slightly wincy scene of the Doctor hanging from a window outside the lighthouse when he's escaping Reuben. And some don't like the Rutan. But this just goes to show that Doctor Who isn't about its effects. It doesn't matter if the effects are a bit ropey 50 years on. It's the story. The story's the thing. And this is a great, very simple story of people trapped somewhere being attacked by something horrible. But it's so beautifully written with great characters, great dialogue, and real sense of period atmosphere. It's fantastic, and it remains one of my go-to Doctor Who's. If you've never seen it, you're a fool. You need to find it straight away. You can still pick up the DVD, I'm sure. And of course, it is available on the season 15 Blu-ray box set with all those little amendments. But watch the original version. It's always the best. Horror Fang Rock gets from me a big chunky 10 out of 10 because I love it unapologetically. Right, thank you for watching this video. I do hope you've enjoyed it. Horror Fang Rock is just such a bolt of nostalgia for me as well, particularly because when the first episode was screened on the 3rd of September, I was halfway across Cardiff at a distant family member's wedding. And this was before you could record episodes. And I got my father to bring me back home to watch the episode. He went back to the wedding and then he came back and collected me. This is about 5-8 miles away from where I lived. You can't buy memories like that. That's fantastic. And I remember so clearly being so anxious of getting away from this wedding to see this Doctor Who episode and then going back to the wedding. Those are sort of memories that you cherish as you get older. So anyway, that's Horror Fang Rock. Let me know what you think of this story. If you don't love it, we may not be friends. Let me know what you think of it. Leave a comment down below. I will see you soon. Until I do, keep taking the stuff.